Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The greater Middle East is poised dangerously. Syria has been at war within and without since 2011. Iraq is witnessing internal political instability and protests once again. The Persian Gulf is witnessing rising tensions. Today we shall discuss the ongoing Turkish offensive in northeastern Syria and an alleged missile attack on an Iranian oil tanker off the Saudi coast. But let's first remind ourselves of the words of Hugh Strachan. Back in 2008, Strachan wrote a paper, A Strategy and the Limitation of War. One of his central points is that we look back at wars in retrospect as single units. That's a mistaken view. His examples of the two world wars, while a broad overview looks at those conflicts as a large war, they began for regional reasons, states entering conflicts for their own reasons until the conflict became wider and wider. As Strachan put it, to understand the First World War as a global war, we have first to disaggregate it into a series of regional conflicts. Once again, we have states entering conflicts for their own reasons. With every step, they entrap themselves in commitment traps and expose themselves to miscalculations. That is the opening thought, but let's go to our experts to see whether we need to give Strachan's analysis a sobering reading. We shall begin with Turkey's offensive, and we have with us Kamran Bokhari, who is the founding director for Center for Global Policies based in Toronto, and Ms. Maram Susli, who is an activist and analyst, joins us from Perth. Kamran, if I might begin with you, I was reading an article that you've written for CGP. Two of the points that you're making in that article, one is that even during the Obama administration, the U.S. wanted Turkey to have a lead role. But there were various reasons for which that didn't come about. And secondly, you're saying that now that Trump has given Turkey the space to create a zone, a buffer zone, the criticism that's coming from officials of the previous administration has more to do with domestic political rivalries than anything more serious in terms of something being wrong with the Trump decision. Have I got the gist of the article correct?
Absolutely, Ejaz. I think that what's happening here is that those who are criticizing the president, are criticizing because of multiple reasons. One, it's partisanship. They don't like the president, and any opportunity they get, they'll say, "Hey, another wrong step, another misstep." And then, of course, people tend to look at Syria in piecemeal fashion. They look at, okay, today we will focus on what the Iranians are doing with the militias. The next day we'll look at ISIS. Then we'll look at the Assad regime, and it goes on and on. There's a need to look at Syria holistically because it is a shattered state with, multiple stakeholders. And the U.S. strategy can't be just based on, okay, what are the Kurds doing today? And so I think that is the reason, that those are some of the principal reasons why people are criticizing the president. The president obviously is operating also from a domestic political imperative. He needs to get reelected. His numbers are doing bad, and he's under a lot of pressure.
Not to say of the impeachment drive, which also complicates matters for him.
Of course, and all that pressure is building up. But the point that I'm making is that we tend to look at our opponents, people whom we don't like, as irrational, as doing things that are blatantly wrong. We don't look at people and say, hey, they were facing a series of bad options. They tried to choose the least bad one. And yes, they can miscalculate. No one is disagreeing with that. But to say that this is a blunder, it makes no sense. I think that that's way too harsh and way too superficial.
Okay, but Kamran, let me go back to what you said about taking a holistic view of Syria. Now, if we look at it as a wicked problem and we use the wicked problem framework, we realize that it's extremely difficult to take a holistic view. And in fact, in this very article, you say that Syria is a shattered country and thus terribly difficult to deal with. working with one stakeholder inevitably leads to problems with another. So how do the policymakers take a holistic view? And I also want to take you back to what the reference to Strachan's 2008 paper, where he's talking about the limitations of strategy. What we have witnessed in the last 17, 18 years is essentially one lesson. Powerful states entering into conflicts and then getting bogged down. So how do we look at this particular offensive, Turkish offensive? We're already getting reports that the ground offensive is getting bogged down. So was this the best way to go about it?
I mean, again, what is best? I think we assume that there are, some better options or good options. Look, Turkey has its entire southern flank on fire. Southern flank being Syria. Turkey can't just sit quietly and hope everything will go away. They have the Kurdish problem. They have 3 million refugees. They have the ISIS problem. There is a government over there. Now, Russia is no longer just to the north of Turkey. It's also to the south of Turkey. Iran, its historical foe, has blocked Turkey both in Iraq and Syria. So this is an intolerable growing security threat for Turkey. It has to move. And so I think that a better option, I think that terminology needs changing. As for what Strachan said, I agree. Look, maybe 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will look back at the post-9/11 conflicts in the Middle East and give it a name and say, hey, this was like a regional war.
Yeah.
While things are happening, people tend to look at things differently. So, Libya is different than Yemen, and Yemen is different from Iraq, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But, later on, analysts and researchers and academics will come up with fancy terms and say this was that great regional war. I think he's right. As to how policymakers can look, at Syria holistically, well, looking at Syria holistically just means to be mindful of the various players on the chessboard. Now, Can you make all those chess moves at the same time? No, you're going to take it one step at a time. And of course, look, Turkey has a strategic relationship with the United States. The Americans were never going to sacrifice that just to make sure that the Kurds remain happy. It is what it is. I'm not saying, the Kurds are less people or Turks are more. I'm just saying one is a smaller player, the other is a big player. That's the reality.
No, absolutely. You're using this framework. I agree. Stay with me, Kamran. Let me just go over to Maram Susli. Ms. Susli, what are your initial thoughts about this particular offensive? And of course, there's a long trajectory behind this of Ankara wanting to get that space to do this.
Well, I think I agree with you that this war in Syria needs to be seen in terms of the wider regional war, and in fact, the wars that the US has been waging perhaps since Afghanistan in the 80s. And of course, we have to look at this as a chessboard as well, with many stakeholders or empires that want their own stake or agenda met. And we have to consider what those agendas are. And for the United States, one of the things on its list of wants in Syria was to get rid of chemical weapons. That was something that they wanted even before the war began in 2004. And another was to carve out mini statelets to divide and conquer the region and to create a situation where there would be perpetual warfare. And this is something that they wrote about even while they were conducting the Iraq War and writing the Iraqi constitution to federalize it. If we go back...
But Maram, look at it like this. If the Russians are there. The Russians are there primarily because of Bashar al-Assad. Iran is there primarily because of Bashar al-Assad. Turkey, of course, is a regional player and it wants to secure its near abroad. The Saudis also have their own role to play. The US got into this because it is allied with, Saudi Arabia, with Turkey. So what I'm saying is that while this divide and rule thing is, of course, historically absolutely accurate. The fact is that there are regional players that have their own statist or non-statist interests. And what is happening now in Syria and elsewhere in the greater Middle East has to do more with the regional players than the external or extra-regional players. And whenever there is an extra-regional player there, it is because that player is allied with some regional player. So primarily, we're looking at the interests of the regional players.
Indeed, and the reason the U.S. is in Syria is because of its alliance with Israel and its, the influence of the Zionist lobby in the United States, because they see Syria as a threat to Israel. So yes, that is really the reason why the U.S. wants a Kurdistan, because Oded Yunon in Israel wrote a strategy for Israel to create these ethno-states or religious states in the Middle East, and one of which was Kurdistan, to try to basically weaken its rivals in the region by having them fight amongst each other. Now, this is what the US wants, but it's in fact the opposite of what Turkey wants, because of course, creating a Kurdistan in Syria would be a threat to their national security, given that even Trump admitted that they were empowering the PKK terrorist organization that was conducting terrorist attacks in Turkey because they're a separatist group of anarcho-Marxists that want to create a Kurdistan. So in this scenario, the U.S. in this chessboard, it wanted Assad to fall. Had Assad fell, they could have rewritten the Syrian constitution to include federalism, thereby legitimizing their occupation and theft of the oil and remaining in the oil-rich regions of Syria. But they weren't able to do that. And as we know, a few weeks ago, the Syrian Constitutional Committee was formed at the United Nations, and the Kurdish group was not included, which meant that federalism was just simply not on the agenda. And at that time, if you recall, Pompeo was in fact threatening Syria, claiming there was some kind of chemical attack that happened in May and that the US may act on it. This was around the same time that a few days later, Trump made this announcement that he's going to pull back, allow Turkey in. This is because I think he's realized that since there's not going to be a legitimization of the US presence in Syria, nothing on the chessboard is going to change. And every move that the US makes at this point is checkmate. Whether they help the Kurds, they're going to lose Turkey. If they help Turkey, they lose the Kurds. If they pull out, they've lost in Syria because the Syrian military will make an alliance with the Kurds. I mean, at this point, it's a matter of sunk cost. The longer they stay, the more they will lose. And if you look at it strategically, that's how it is.
That's a complex chessboard. I will go back to Dr. Kamran Bokhari, but before that, the news that is coming out of the area says that thousands of civilians are fleeing from the border areas as Turkey presses assault against Kurdish forces for the third straight day. Turkish forces, according to the Turkish Ministry of Defense, have killed at least 277 Kurdish fighters in a major military operation. This is, as I said, the Defense Ministry saying this. President Erdogan says the offensive is aimed at removing Kurdish-led forces from the border area and creating a safe zone so millions of Syrian refugees can be returned. The Turkish Defense Ministry has also confirmed the death of at least one Turkish soldier. Other than that, there have been dozens of fighters from the Kurdish-led Syrian Defense Forces and pro-Turkish factions that have been killed, according to some other reports. Kamran, as Maram Susli was saying, I mean, this is a complicated chessboard. So is this completely sort of zero-sum, or there are opportunities here? Because Turkey has had agreements or you create a modus vivendi with the Kurds. That has happened on previous occasions. So what exactly are we looking at? Turkey going in, getting rid of the armed Kurdish militias, but also creating some kind of political sort of settlement with the Kurds there?
Yes, Ejaz. I think that the first order of business for the Turks is to go in, weaken the Syrian Kurdish military capabilities, the militia is a very potent force. It won against ISIS. So the first order of business for Turkey is to make sure that these Kurds are not a threat to Turkey. And once that has happened, what they will do is they will cut a deal. But you never go in and you cut a deal from the get-go, as everybody knows. You basically move militarily, and then you get to a point where then you can negotiate from a position of relative strength. Now, that may take a long time. That may not take a long time. We just don't know. It's just the beginning of the Turkish military expedition. So I think that needs to be kept in mind, that this is not a zero-sum game. There is no way it can be a zero-sum game because it's just not physically possible. Turkey would have to expend an impossible level of resources, and still there's no guarantee that they can completely neutralize the PYD, as it is known by its acronym, the Kurdish political party, and its militia, the YPG, and of course its coalition militia, the Syrian Defense Forces.
Okay, so I was talking about this very issue yesterday also, and someone based in Syria said, well, you know, if the Turks wanted to create a buffer zone, they could have done it on their side of the border. I was kind of pressing the point that, you know, that's in a way not really possible, because buffer zones states, when they're powerful and they want to, you know, have safe borders, they would create the buffer zones towards the borders of the other state rather than towards their own side. I mean, that's what the Israelis have also done in South Lebanon. But the Turkish, primarily what they're trying to do here, and correct me if I've got that wrong, is to then try and resettle most of the Syrian refugees on Turkish soil within camps in the buffer zone?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the eventual or long-term, medium-term goal. But right now, the Turks are trying to alter the balance of power. Mind you, Russia and Iran-backed Syrian regime forces have had the upper hand in the battle space. Sunni Arab militias, some of them went to ISIS, some of them went to Al-Qaeda, some of them are independent Salafi jihadi, but really Syrian Sunni nationalist Arab militias were defeated when they lost Aleppo in December of 2016. What the Turks are trying to do is to create a Sunni Arab force, a proxy force, just like the Israelis did in South Lebanon with the Christian militia called the South Lebanon Army. Yeah. And what they're trying to do is to say, okay, this force will be our ally, our local ally. We don't want this to be an occupation. Makes sense. No country wants to expend its resources. They want to minimize that. And so that force will then serve as a leverage against the Kurds. It will keep ISIS out of sight. And then in the long run, they would want to be able to then go to Assad and negotiate from a position of strength. That's the strategy. Will it play out? Well, we'll have to see.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Kamran Bokhari speaking with us. Let me quickly go back to Maram Susli here. Maram, what happens if this offensive gets bogged down? Then it's going to be like what we've seen in Afghanistan, elsewhere, and so on. And the cost of it is going to, go up, and the objectives will remain unachieved. Is there a thought in Ankara on that possibility or contingency?
Well, I think if they strategically don't want to minimize their losses, their best case scenario would be, in fact, the Kurds making a deal with Damascus. Because if they can, basically what Turkey wants to prevent is the strengthening of the PKK and the possibility that there's going to be an autonomous Kurdish region. That's the point of the buffer zone. So if they can get the Kurds to negotiate with Damascus... Is that the
only objective? Because the sense that I get, and I might be wrong, but the sense that I get is that is the immediate tactical objective, but there is a larger objective also. I mean, in terms of Turkey's traditional sort of view of its near abroad, also the fact that it is one of the more powerful regional states, that it also wants to have some kind of leadership role in the greater Middle East. So that it becomes a third actor there. You've got the Iranians trying to do that. You've got the Saudis trying to checkmate the Iranians. And now you've got Turkey getting into the fray also.
Well, I think that Turkey wants some leverage over Damascus so that they can renegotiate their relationship, because Syria is on their border, of course. So yes, that is. But I think their main concern is the prevention of a Kurdistan, and that's why I think it's impossible for them to negotiate some kind of deal with the PYD, because they've labeled it a terrorist organization, and it's much more likely that they would want Damascus to do that deal, whereby the Kurds would give up on their idea of becoming separatists and creating their own autonomous region or controlling regions of Syria.
Okay, I have another question also, where I'll come back to you with that question. I've been joined by George Szamuely, who joins me from Budapest. He's a Middle East expert. Mr. Szamuely, thank you for being on the program. We're just trying to figure out, of course, it's obvious there's been a long trajectory of Turkey trying to get the space to move into northeastern Syria, which now they've got. And there's a lot of criticism within the United States about President Trump's decision. But given how it's going, what are your initial thoughts about it?
The United States is obviously doing what the United States always does, or at least its policy-making elite, which is that the moment the subject of American withdrawal comes up, the entire policy-making elite goes crazy and said, no withdrawal, because of all these terrible things are going to happen. There's going to be genocide over Kurds. ISIS is going to come back, and every kind of nightmare scenario. So we've heard this story before. When Trump proposed withdrawing from Afghanistan, then we heard suddenly the women of Afghanistan, will soon be, in burqas forever. So there's always a reason to maintain an American military presence. But returning to your question, I think that this was an inevitable consequence of U.S. policy. The U.S. policy, which had been fostering Kurdish separatism in opposition to Turkey, in opposition to Damascus, was bound to lead to catastrophe. And whatever else you may think about President Trump, it wasn't Trump's policy. I mean, he inherited an absolutely catastrophic, criminally irresponsible policy from the Obama administration, which first moved in, started sponsoring jihadi extremists against the government in Damascus, then switched sides and decided to fight ISIS itself by supporting the SDF. So Obama just was dealt a very bad hand, and I think what he's done here in just simply saying, look, there's nothing much we can do. We can't sit here and help create a kind of an independent Kurdistan within Syria. I mean, that was pretty much, the only thing that he could do in the circumstances. Okay,
without prejudice to what you're saying, and I think I largely agree with you. But here's the situation. The Kurdish separatism has a long history, much before the U.S. got into this fray. But as far as purely the Syrian situation was concerned, I think the U.S. was using the Kurdish militias essentially as ground tactics to deal with ISIS fighters. And if that kind of gave the Kurds another sort of, sense of they can have an autonomous region, then that seems to be a byproduct of that and not exactly the direct objective of the U.S. policy.
Well, I think that's correct, but an autonomous region would have to be something negotiated with the government of Damascus, and it would have to be part of the constitutional talks that are currently taking place. You can't just simply go into another country, carve out a piece of territory and say, hey, this is your autonomous region. I mean, this Syria does not belong
I agree
to the
with
United States. I mean, it belongs to the Syrian people. So any kind of autonomy has to be negotiated with the legal government in Syria, and has to be within the context of ongoing constitutional talks.
So right now, there is there's the immediate objective of creating a buffer zone, which is what Turkey is trying to do. But if we go back to 2011, Turkey was essentially telling Damascus, Bashar al-Assad, that you need to give a voice to the people. And Bashar al-Assad thought that Turkey was kind of interfering in Syria's internal affairs, and that Turkey also considered Syria as its near abroad, and that somehow, if he were to agree to what Ankara was saying, that Syria would not retain sovereignty as an equal sort of partner with Turkey. So does the larger Turkish objective of having influence in Syria still remains, or have they sort of pared down those expectations, and what they're doing now in trying to create a buffer zone is now the main objective?
Well, I think they do retain some ambition, the ambitions that you described. Maybe reworking the treaties that followed the World War I, retaking territory that had once been a part of Turkey. No doubt Erdogan does think in those terms. It's not feasible because he needs to maintain good relations with Russia. Russia has been quite generous with him on this current incursion, but he's part of the Astana process, and the Russians aren't going to put up with his taking over any piece of territory. So he is going to have to work something out with Damascus, which is what the Russians
with Damascus. I think, I think I agree with you. This is all the time I have. Thank you so much. That was George Szamuely speaking with us. Very quickly, back to Maram Susli here. Maram, what are we expecting in the next 1 week? Very quickly.
Well, potentially we might expect a deal between the YPG and Damascus, or we might expect the U.S. to basically just move troops to the oil field and remain there. We might expect deaths from civilians in the crossfire between Turkey and the Kurdish forces. We might expect the Syrian army to cross the Euphrates into the oil fields. There are a lot of things that could possibly happen in the coming week.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Maram speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the alleged missile attack on an Iranian tanker off the coast of Saudi Arabia. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We are obviously talking about the Middle East. As I said in the previous segment, the greater Middle East is dangerously poised. And I also talked about the fact that, we look back at wars and we analyze them as single units when they're not. And a lot of work has been done on that. Now, we're talking about Turkey's offensive into northeastern Syria. We're also going to talk about the explosions that hit an Iranian oil tanker on Friday. And it set the ship on fire. We got the report from an Iranian news agency, as also other news outlets. The vessel is owned by Iran's state-owned National Iranian Oil Company, which identified it as the Sabiti. No casualties were reported in the incident. The company, according to some reports, has denied the tanker got a missile hit. The Russian Foreign Ministry has also said that it's too early to assign the reason and the blame for the explosions. That may be so, but given previous incidents in which Iran was blamed, it is easy for such situations to get manipulated. To discuss this, we have with us Mehrdad Khonsari, who is a former Iranian diplomat and a veteran politician and a prominent Iranian opposition figure, joins us from London, and Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm, who is an analyst based in Tehran. Let me begin with Mr. Khonsari here. Mr. Khonsari, we were talking about earlier, so obviously we're going to discuss this particular event also as a peg, but we're discussing the dangerous environment in the greater Middle East with various state actors vying for greater power projection and also using their proxies. Given that, and given this particular incident, we still don't have any real confirmation about the missile hit. But this and the previous incidents in the Persian Gulf, what are your initial thoughts about the possibilities of miscalculations and the manipulation of the situation?
Well, I think obviously, this incident has ratcheted up an already very tenuous situation. And obviously, I think all parties are anxious to avoid matters from getting out of hand. But as you rightly pointed out, miscalculations, wrong movements, accidents can lead to situations that parties have not counted on. And we have seen this happen in history, and there's no reason why it should not happen in this instant. Obviously, this attack or this incident that took place against the Iranian vessel has the tendency and the capacity to escalate matters. And obviously, until such time that it is clearly assigned as to what party is responsible for this, then I think cool heads should prevail, and there should be a great deal of attention on the part of both Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the United States, to contain this thing at this stage.
Mr. Khonsari, as you know well, what's happening in the Persian Gulf, now this had happened in the Persian Gulf, but previous incidents, they were all blamed on Iran, and Iran vehemently denied being involved in any attacks on tankers or the attack on one of the Saudi oil fields. Now, an Iranian tanker has been hit. Multiple reports, some reports about explosions on the tanker, other reports talk about a missile strike and all of that. It seems to me that, someone is doing something. I mean, how does this work out? It's pretty confusing. Who is doing this?
Well, I think that obviously in the previous incidents, the deniability factor on all the explosions that took place in the Persian Gulf, even prior to the attack on the Saudi oil fields or oil installations, there was always a deniability factor. In other words, some parties accused Iran, but Iran always denied and had a plausible cause or case for deniability. We have a similar situation right now. There are parties, I've heard rumors as early as now, which is only a few hours after the incident, that this incident may in fact have been perpetuated by the Iranians themselves in the waters of the Red Sea, away from the Persian Gulf, in order to distract attention away from themselves and say that a tit for tat has taken place. There are all kinds of speculations. And of course, what this incident has in common with the other incidents is the deniability factor. Any party who may have actually carried out such an operation has a cause to deny it, and there's no way that it can be conclusively proven. But what the threat, of course, and the problem here is the threat of escalation and for things getting out of hand, which is the matter that you first raised.
Absolutely. Put it brilliantly, Khonsari. This is exactly the kind of manipulation of the situation that I was talking about. But let me pull in Mostafa Khoshcheshm here. Mostafa, rumors that it could be an Iranian false flag kind of, seem far-fetched. But what are your initial thoughts, and what is the information with you with reference to this incident?
Well, hello, and thanks for having me. As a matter of fact, the missile attack has happened for sure. This has been a missile attack. The tanker has been hit by 2 missiles from short distance, actually, in the same area. But this has not been the only incident in the region. Several months ago, 4 Iranian tankers were moving across the same waters, and then suddenly they started having problems with their engines and the engine malfunctioning. 3 could eventually repair the engines. and moved out of the region. But the fourth one, Happiness One, was brought to a standstill. It was taken to the Saudi port, and the Saudis did not release the ship for several weeks, demanding $200,000 from Iran in a case that was rather unprecedented between the two countries. So even then, unofficial reports and informal reports released a few days later proved that this has been a cyber attack, a sabotage attack. And we do know that the Saudis do not have sophisticated IT technology, and all their IT needs are provided by the Americans, of course. But this could have been a collaboration by the Saudis as well as the Americans. But today's attack was, something way bigger, and it couldn't be compared with the previous one, because now the military aspect has come into, the theater, and there is a military factor involved in here. Two missiles have been fired, and this shows the depth of hostility. Though Tehran has not pointed a finger at anyone, Tehran doesn't have any other foes in the same region except for the Saudis. But more importantly, this attack came in the backdrop of an imminent trip to Tehran by a Pakistani Prime Minister, Imran Khan, reportedly for mediation between the two sides. For sure, the attack undermines Imran Khan's mediation efforts that would be on the way tomorrow. And this could have undermined any kind of mediation between the two sides. Iran doesn't want an escalation in this region. Iran doesn't want more pressures on its crude exports. That a couple of weeks ago, the Iranian president and the Iranian delegation at the UN, they presented a peace initiative for waterways, not just the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf waters, but also for all waterways, including Bab el-Mandeb and elsewhere, which was not received by the Americans. Now, Iran wants peace and de-escalation in the region, and surely this attack is a bad response to Iran's efforts for cooling down the situation, because today's attack caused a 2% increase in global oil prices, almost 2%. And everybody across the globe is paying the price now for the attack on the Iranian ship today. The situation could get out of control. For sure, those that have done this, they are living in a glass house. And those living in a glass house should never throw stone at others. This miscalculation by those that have been behind the attack, that they could lay pressure on Tehran before Imran Khan's tomorrow visit and mediation efforts on Saturday, this miscalculation could go wrong. Could end up in escalation of the situation in the region, in both waterways, in the Persian Gulf and in Bab el-Mandeb, as well as the Red Sea, and across the region. So okay. I believe there needs to be some mediation efforts by other global actors.
Let me go back to Khonsari here. Mr. Khonsari, I'm happy actually that Mostafa talked about the mediation efforts that the Pakistani Prime Minister agreed to. But my sense is that Riyadh also asked Mr. Khan to do this. So that means that Riyadh also doesn't have too much appetite for conflict. Tehran has always said that it does not want conflict in the region. It does not want any escalation. But would you agree that this got timed with Mr. Khan's upcoming visit to Tehran, or is it just sheer coincidence? Because we are all as human beings predisposed to what, the frameworks that we already carry within our minds.
Well, this happens to coincide with this, so it's very difficult to think that if there are people with certain calculations behind this incident, that it could not have been associated with Imran Khan's imminent visit to Tehran. I agree also with the analysis that my compatriot gave a few moments ago. Iran has no reason to want to provoke or to provoke such an incident or to want to escalate matters. And as you rightly pointed out, the Saudis themselves have been a party to asking Imran Khan to sort of enter into this dialogue with Iran in order to try and find a way out. But you have to bear in mind that within Iran, there is not unanimity in terms of wanting to initiate dialogues that leads to some kind of a accommodation between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iran and the United States. There are people in Iran, amongst the very hardliners, who oppose any kind of action in this direction. And if you want to look at the dark side of this situation, those people have an incentive in wanting to sabotage Imran Khan's visit and the whole thrust of what Imran Khan is doing, which goes beyond just Iran, Saudi Arabia, but includes ultimately Iran's bilateral talks with the United States, either open or behind the scenes, or for that matter, the question of sanctions relief, which is of paramount importance to Iran. So there are people who gain to benefit in their domestic political calculations in Iran. And sadly, because of the way that they have behaved in the past, it is quite conceivable that they could have something to do with this kind of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for these insights, Mr. Mehrdad Khonsari, Mr. Mostafa Khoshcheshm. This is all from Indus News this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.